I watched in horror as HOA bulldozers invaded my private island to install 172 solar panels without my consent. What would you do when a power-hungry HOA president and her cronies turn your paradise into an industrial nightmare? I jumped out of bed as the rumbling sound shook my windows. Outside, yellow bulldozers crashed through my garden fence. My heart raced as I ran onto my porch in my pajamas. "Stop! What are you doing on my property?" I shouted, but the workers ignored me, continuing to dig up my flower beds and knock down the small trees I had planted last fall. Frantically, I grabbed my phone and dialed the police. "There are people with bulldozers tearing up my yard." "Sir, we've already received a call from the Pinehurst Point HOA. They have proper permits for this work," the officer replied. I was stunned. I had bought this private island home 6 months ago because it promised peace and quiet. Yes, it was connected to the mainland community by a small bridge, but my deed clearly stated that the island was my private property. I threw on some clothes and marched across my ruined lawn to find whoever was in charge. A woman in an expensive suit stood by a black SUV, checking items off a clipboard. "Excuse me, what's happening here?" I demanded. She looked up, her face showing slight annoyance at being interrupted. "Mr. Reynolds, I presume. I'm Judith Palmer, president of the Pinehurst Point Homeowners Association." "Why are bulldozers destroying my garden?" I asked, my voice trembling with anger. Judith smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "We've approved the installation of 172 solar panels on the eastern shore of your property. It's for the community's benefit." I struggled to keep my voice level. "This is my private island. You can't just—" "Actually, we can," she interrupted, pulling a document from her designer bag. "Section 8, paragraph 12 of the covenant you signed states that the association reserves access rights to waterfront properties for community improvements." My stomach dropped. I remembered signing a thick stack of papers at closing, but my lawyer had assured me everything was standard. "I want to see that covenant again," I insisted. "Of course," she replied, her smile growing colder. "Stop by the HOA office anytime, but the work continues." A second bulldozer crashed through my gazebo, where I had enjoyed coffee every morning while watching the sunrise. The workers began marking spots for concrete foundations. I called my real estate lawyer, Simon, who promised to look into it right away. "Don't sign anything else," he warned. That evening, I sat on my damaged porch, watching workers set up floodlights to continue through the night. The peaceful lake view I had saved 20 years to enjoy was now a construction zone. My neighbor from across the lake, Eleanor Wallace, an elderly woman who'd lived in Pinehurst Point for decades, rowed over in her small boat. "I came as soon as I heard," she said, carefully climbing onto my dock. "This isn't right. Can they really do this? It's my property." Eleanor sighed. "Judith changed many rules after she became president 3 years ago. The solar project was her big promise during the election, but everyone thought it would go on the community center roof." "Why my island?" I asked. "Your property has the best sun exposure." She hesitated. "Judith tried to buy this island last year, but the previous owner refused to sell to her." A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just about solar energy. When Simon called the next morning, his voice was grim. "The covenant does include that clause, but there's something fishy. That section looks like it was amended recently, but I need to check the county records to confirm." I walked down to the construction site, where workers were unloading metal frames. "Where's Miss Palmer?" I asked one of them. "Board meeting at the community center," he replied, not looking up. I drove my boat across the lake rather than taking the bridge. The community center was a large building with a view of the entire lake. Inside, about 40 neighbors sat in rows of chairs, while Judith stood at a podium. "The solar initiative will reduce everyone's electric bills by approximately 35%, she was saying as I slipped into a back seat. "It qualifies us for the state's green community tax benefits." A middle-aged man raised his hand. My understanding was that the panels would go on the community center. When did this change? The engineering survey showed insufficient roof support. Judith answered smoothly. Mr. Reynolds's island gets 40% more direct sunlight, making it the ideal location. I stood up. Did anyone bother asking me or showing me this so-called survey? The room fell silent as everyone turned to look at me. Judith's lips tightened. Mr. Reynolds, we welcome all homeowners to meetings, but please wait to be recognized before speaking. A woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and oversized sunglasses stood up. Point of order, Judith. New homeowners should be informed of how things work here. She turned to me with a smile that somehow felt threatening. I'm Karen Matthews, HOA Vice President. We understand this is an adjustment, but you'll soon see the benefits of our community-first approach. By community-first, you mean taking over my private property without my consent? I asked. Karen's smile didn't waver. The covenant you signed gives the association certain rights. Perhaps you should have read it more carefully. Several homeowners looked uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. This meeting is about the budget, not reopening decided matters, Judith said firmly. Security, please escort Mr. Reynolds out if he can't observe proper meeting protocol. A large man in uniform approached me. Rather than make a scene, I left, but not before noticing Eleanor and a few others watching me with sympathetic eyes. Back on my island, the workers had already installed the first row of concrete foundations. My phone rang. Simon again. I checked the county records, he said. That covenant clause was indeed amended, but there's a problem. It should have required 75% homeowner approval and state registration. I can't find records of either. Hope surged through me. So their whole project is illegal. It's complicated, Simon cautioned. They could claim verbal approval or lost paperwork. We need more evidence. Later that evening, there was a knock at my door. It was Eleanor, looking nervous. I shouldn't be here, she whispered, but you need to know. Judith's husband owns the company installing the panels, and Karen's brother runs the maintenance contract. My mind raced. That's a conflict of interest. Be careful, Eleanor warned. The last person who questioned Judith's authority found his boat mysteriously damaged and received fines for violations nobody else gets cited for. As she left, I watched more trucks arrive with steel frames and glass panels. Tomorrow, they would begin installing the actual solar panels, 172 of them across my once beautiful shoreline. What would happen if I physically blocked them from continuing their invasion of my private paradise? 2 weeks passed, and the solar array stood complete. 172 gleaming panels arranged in rows facing the sun. I couldn't escape them. They reflected blinding light into my living room each afternoon. At night, maintenance lights blinked constantly, keeping me awake. I tried fighting through proper channels. I filed formal complaints with the county, spoke at 3 HOA meetings, and even hired an inspector who confirmed the installation violated several building codes. Nothing changed. Your inspection is invalid, Judith told me over the phone. Our contractors are certified green energy specialists. I tried reasoning with my neighbors at the community pool. Most avoided eye contact. A few whispered they agreed with me but feared retaliation from the board. My son lost pool privileges last summer after my husband questioned the new assessment fees, one woman murmured before quickly walking away. I brought documentation to the next HOA meeting. Property maps, my deed, county ordinances about waterfront construction. Karen Matthews cut me off mid-presentation. The community needs sustainable energy, she insisted, adjusting her designer sunglasses even though we were indoors. Your selfish attitude is disappointing, especially since we grandfathered your boathouse despite it being 6 inches taller than regulations permit. I hadn't even known about the boathouse violation. They were clearly monitoring my property for any possible infractions. That evening, I received a certified letter. The HOA was fining me $200 daily for unapproved landscaping changes. The flower beds I had replanted after their bulldozers destroyed my garden couldn't sleep. The maintenance lights from the solar array flickered through my bedroom windows. I tossed and turned, feeling trapped on my own island. Around 3 a.m., desperate for distraction, I began reading through the box of books I'd inherited from my grandfather, but never opened. Among dusty novels and photo albums, I found a leather journal. My grandfather had been a botanist specializing in native trees. The journal contained detailed notes on species that flourished in our region. One page caught my attention. Hybrid poplars alongside empress trees create natural privacy screens. Both species exhibit growth rates of 8 to 12 feet yearly in optimal conditions. A plan began forming in my mind. The next morning, I visited Eleanor Wallace. Her lakeside cottage was surrounded by the most beautiful garden in the community. "Those solar panels are an eyesore," she said, inviting me in for tea. Judith claimed they'd be hidden by landscaping, but that was clearly a lie. I showed her my grandfather's journal. "I'm thinking about planting trees along my shoreline." Eleanor's eyes twinkled mischievously. "Fast-growing trees to block solar panels? I have something special in my greenhouse. Hybrid poplars and empress trees. They grow even faster than your grandfather recorded. With my special fertilizer mix, would you sell me some seedlings?" "Better than that," Eleanor said. "I'll help you plant them. I've been propagating these beauties for years." My bank account suffered as I withdrew my savings, but watching Eleanor load 200 seedlings onto my boat felt like the first victory in this battle. We calculated the sun's path and determined exactly where to place each tree for maximum solar blockage. That night, I began planting under cover of darkness, working with just a small headlamp. The soil was still loose from the construction, making it easier to dig. I had planted nearly 30 seedlings when bright light suddenly flooded the shoreline. "What are you doing out here so late?" I froze, dirt-covered shovel in hand. The security guard hired by the HOA approached, flashlight aimed at my face. "Just doing some late-night gardening," I said, trying to sound casual. "Cooler at night." He lowered his flashlight. "Those look like trees." "Decorative shrubs," I lied, "for privacy." The guard studied the small saplings. Ms. Palmer specifically instructed us to report any activity near the solar installation. My heart sank. I'd be shut down before I could finish planting. To my surprise, the guard's face softened. My grandfather had his farm taken through eminent domain for a shopping mall. Never sat right with me. He clicked off his flashlight. "I don't come to this side of the island until 2 a.m. That gives you 3 more hours." After he left, I worked frantically, planting saplings in perfectly spaced rows where they would eventually block the panels. By dawn, all 200 were in the ground, each one representing hope. The next day, I reinforced my legal position. Simon helped me file a formal appeal with the county zoning board. I also contacted the State Environmental Protection Office about potential wetland disruption from the installation. I was working from home when someone pounded on my front door. Karen Matthews stood there, face flushed with anger. "Remove those trees immediately. They violate Section 12.4 of the Landscaping Covenant." "Which prohibits what exactly?" I asked calmly. "Unauthorized modifications that impact community assets." I smiled. "Interesting interpretation, but Section 5.7 explicitly permits homeowners to plant native species for erosion control, which is exactly what I've done after your construction damaged my shoreline." Karen's eyes narrowed. "The board will vote on this tonight. You'll face significant fines. I'll be at the meeting to present my case." After she stormed off, my phone dinged with a text from an unknown number. "Check your email. Sent documents you need." Not everyone supports Judith's solar scheme. The email contained meeting minutes from 2 years ago. The board had indeed voted for a solar project, but specifically approved placing panels on the community center roof. There was no mention of my island. At that evening's emergency board meeting, the room was packed. News of our conflict had spread through the neighborhood. "These trees were planted maliciously to obstruct the solar array," Judith declared. "Mr. Reynolds must remove them and pay for any damage to the installation." "May I respond?" I asked, standing. Karen smirked. 2 minutes. I projected the meeting minutes onto the wall. "The board never approved installing panels on my property. The vote 2 years ago specifically designated the community center roof." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judith's face tightened. "Plans evolved based on engineering requirements without proper votes or homeowner notification," I countered. "Additionally, county records show no permits were filed for construction on my private island." An older man stood up from the back. "Point of order. As former board treasurer, I recall we were told this installation required a 75% community vote since it represented over $100,000 in expenditure." Judith glared at him. "We had emergency authorization from whom?" Several voices asked simultaneously. The meeting dissolved into chaotic arguments. I noticed Eleanor smiling proudly from her seat. As I left, 3 neighbors approached to offer support. One was a contractor who promised to check whether the installation met code requirements. Another worked for the local newspaper and asked if I'd share documentation for a possible story. For the first time, I felt I might win this battle. That night, I slept soundly, despite the blinking lights, dreaming of tall trees shading my property. A loud crash jolted me awake at dawn. Looking outside, my blood ran cold. A landscaping crew was on my shoreline, chainsaws running. They were cutting down my newly planted trees. Who had authorized this new assault on my property? And how far was I willing to go to defend my island? 6 months passed in a blur of dirt, sweat, and hope. I woke before dawn each day to tend my growing rebellion. My hands cracked and bled from digging in rocky soil, but I couldn't stop. Not with Judith watching from her boat, binoculars trained on my every move. "Look at them," I whispered to my trees one misty morning. Already 5 feet tall, the hybrid poplars and empress trees shot up faster than I dared hope. Their leaves rustled like applause when I walked among them, my secret weapon against HOA tyranny. Across the water, residents complained about the solar panels, the harsh glare bouncing off them at sunset, the buzzing noise from inverters, the maintenance trucks rumbling down their quiet streets at odd hours. Yet nobody dared challenge Judith directly, until my trees began casting the first shadows. "Emergency meeting," screamed the red-lettered email from the HOA. I smiled. They'd noticed. I walked into the community center with my head high. The room fell silent as neighbors turned to stare. "Item 1. Illegal vegetation on lakefront property," Judith announced, slamming her gavel. Her normally perfect hair looked frazzled today. "Those trees must go." "Why?" I asked calmly. "They're native species, drought-resistant and excellent for preventing erosion." "They're blocking our community investment," Karen Matthews shouted from beside Judith, her designer sunglasses unable to hide her rage. "Do you know how much those solar panels cost?" I replied. "Approximately $438,000, which is odd since the market rate should have been closer to $300,000. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Judith's face paled. "I'm curious who chose SUNTC Industries for installation," I continued, "especially since their CEO plays golf with your husband every Wednesday, Miss Palmer." "That's irrelevant." Judith banged her gavel again. "We're discussing your deliberate sabotage of community property." "I'm simply landscaping my land," I said with a shrug. "Section 5 of our covenant clearly states homeowners may cultivate vegetation for aesthetic and privacy purposes. I find these trees very aesthetically pleasing." Thomas Harrison, my mainland neighbor, suddenly stood up. I'd counted him as an ally after he complained about solar glare on his deck. "I move we amend the bylaws to restrict tree height on waterfront properties." The betrayal hit me like a punch. Later, I'd learn about the tax break Judith had promised him. Such amendments require a 75% vote, I reminded everyone, clutching my printed copy of the bylaws and proper notification to all members. Judith's thin smile chilled me. We'll hold the vote next week. I'm sure everyone will see reason. I underestimated her determination. While I tended my growing trees, Judith began her campaign. She visited seasonal homes, gathered proxy votes from absent owners, and spread rumors about my environmental sabotage. I came home one rainy Thursday to find my island invaded again. Yellow notices stood like enemy flags throughout my saplings. Vegetation violation. Remove within 48 hours or face daily fines of $500. My stomach dropped. At $500 per day, they'd bankrupt me within months. As thunder rolled across the lake, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. "Hello?" I answered, watching rain drip from my trees. "Don't remove a single sapling," whispered a voice I didn't recognize. "Check your email. I've sent something you need to see." "Who is this?" I demanded, but the line went dead. Lightning flashed, illuminating the solar panels that had ruined my view. They gleamed like alien technology against the stormy sky. With shaking hands, I opened my laptop. Who would help me now? And would this mysterious evidence arrive in time to save my trees? The mysterious email appeared in my inbox with no subject line, just a single attachment labeled truth.pdf. My hands trembled as I clicked. Was this help or another trap? Pages from yellowed HOA meeting minutes filled my screen, dated 12 years ago before I bought my island paradise. Someone had highlighted a crucial sentence in bright yellow. Amendment 8.3. Any community improvement project on private property requires written approval from the affected homeowner and a majority vote from association members. I gasped. This amendment had vanished from my covenant copy. The solar installation violated their own rules. Who sent this? I whispered to my empty living room. My trees swayed outside the window, their leaves glimmering with raindrops, as if whispering back. Someone on your side. A voice echoed in my mind. Sleep abandoned me that night. I dug through boxes in my attic until sunrise, hunting for my closing documents. The original covenant copy glowed under my flashlight. Amendment 8.3 was missing. They had given me doctored papers. I paced my kitchen, gulping coffee and planning my next move. A direct confrontation seemed dangerous. Judith had power, connections, and money. I had trees and truth. The local newspaper refused my story. Can't risk offending advertisers, the editor explained nervously. The county inspector claimed no jurisdiction over private community matters, mumbling while avoiding eye contact. My lawyer called it complicated and suggested working within the system. Frustration boiled inside me. The system was rigged. Meanwhile, my deadline approached. Only 24 hours remained before the $500 daily fines would begin. A wild idea struck me. I grabbed my phone and called a local TV station. Consumer Watchdog Department, answered a bored voice. I have a story about HOA corruption, forged documents, and mysterious financial dealings, I blurted, plus environmental destruction on a private island. Silence. We can send someone tomorrow afternoon. Too late, I need action now. My doorbell rang, startling me. Through the peephole, I spotted Judith Palmer herself standing on my porch in her designer raincoat, tapping her expensive shoes impatiently. My heart pounded as I opened the door. "We need to talk," she announced, brushing past me into my home without waiting for an invitation. "About the trees I won't be removing," I challenged, crossing my arms. "About your continued defiance," she said, pacing my living room and examining my possessions with obvious disdain. The board voted. Your vegetation violations will cost $750 per day, not $500. That's illegal, I protested. You can't change fines without proper notice. Her laugh chilled me. We can do whatever we want. Who's going to stop us? You with your pathetic little trees? Something snapped inside me. Maybe not me alone, I said quietly, pulling out my phone. But I've been recording everything you've said. Judith froze. You wouldn't dare. I also have these. I showed her the highlighted meeting minutes. Amendment 8.3 is quite clear that you needed my permission for those solar panels. Her face transformed from confident to calculating. Those old minutes are invalid. We updated procedures years ago without proper notification. That's fraud, I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. Amateur legal threats don't scare me, Judith hissed. My husband plays golf with every judge in this county. A knock at my door interrupted our standoff. Judith's eyes narrowed, expecting company. My stomach tightened as I opened the door. Margaret Thompson stood on my porch, the former HOA treasurer who'd retired to Florida 3 years ago. Her silver hair was rain-soaked, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Sorry I'm late," she announced loudly, stepping inside. Traffic was terrible coming from the airport. Judith's face drained of color. "Margaret, what are you doing here?" "Following the money," Margaret replied coolly, nodding toward me. "After he emailed me your little solar scheme, I caught the first flight back." "I hadn't emailed anyone," I said, surprised. Margaret winked at me, a signal to play along. "You have no authority here anymore," Judith snapped. "You're not on the board." "No, but I kept copies of everything during my tenure," Margaret replied, opening her satchel to reveal neatly labeled folders, including the original covenant amendments and, she paused dramatically, the forged documents showing homeowner approvals for the solar project. Judith's composure cracked. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "My husband is currently under federal investigation," Margaret finished calmly. "Why do you think this solar project was rushed through? The kickbacks from SUNTC Industries make a convenient offshore deposit." As Judith lunged for her phone, Margaret added, "I've already spoken with the district attorney. They're quite interested in the HOA's financial records." "You'll regret this," Judith snarled, storming toward the door. "Both of you," she shouted as she slammed out. Margaret's confident demeanor sagged. She sank onto my couch. That woman always was a nightmare. "Thank you," I said, still processing what had happened. "But I never emailed you." Margaret looked puzzled. "Someone did with extensive financial records. I assumed—" We stared at each other. Who else knew about Judith's scheme? "We need to move quickly," Margaret warned. "Judith fights dirty when cornered." We spent hours building our case, organizing evidence, and making calls. Victory seemed possible for the first time. As evening approached, I walked Margaret to her car. "Thank you for coming back to fight this," I said, squeezing her arm. "Some battles are worth fighting." As her taillights disappeared down the road, I felt lighter than I had in months. My gaze drifted across the lake to my island, and my heart stopped. Smoke rose from among my trees, black against the sunset sky. "No!" I screamed, racing toward my boat. Who would burn my island, and could I save my tree army before it was too late? Smoke filled my lungs as I jumped from my boat onto the shore. My beautiful trees were burning. Flames devoured the branches while HOA workers just watched, hoses and equipment nearby. "Stop this right now," I yelled, running toward Derek Williams, the maintenance boss. Derek wouldn't look at me. "Just doing our job, fire safety work," he mumbled, shifting his feet. "Fire safety?" "It rained yesterday. These trees aren't dry." The workers looked at their boots. One guy with a kind face whispered, "We didn't want to do this. She made us." I grabbed my phone and recorded everything. The healthy trees burning, the guilty faces, the unnecessary destruction. Then I called 911. "Fire on Sapphire Lake Island. My property is burning." While waiting for help, I spotted Karen's white SUV parked on the access road. She was taking pictures of me panicking, actually smiling as my trees died. When she saw me notice her, she quickly drove away. The fire trucks arrived with sirens blaring. Chief Rodriguez jumped out first. "What happened here?" "The HOA is burning my trees without permission," I explained, showing him the video I'd taken. "This isn't an approved burn. We never issued a permit," he said, looking angry as his team started spraying water. I felt sick watching my tree army fall. Some were completely black, others barely damaged. My plan to block the solar panels was literally going up in smoke. That night, I couldn't sleep. The smell of burnt wood filled my house. Around midnight, thunder boomed across the lake, and rain pounded my roof as lightning flashed every few minutes. I sat by my window, watching nature's fury, feeling it matched my own anger. A massive lightning bolt struck near the solar panels, so bright it lit up my entire living room. The boom shook my windows, then everything went quiet, except for the rain. At dawn, I walked through my muddy, charred garden to see what happened. The lightning had hit the main control box for the solar panels. The metal box was black and melted, with wires hanging out. At least 30 panels were cracked, some hanging sideways. My phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't know. "Check your email now. Evidence about the fire." The attached photos showed Karen giving money to Derek yesterday morning. Another picture showed a typed order with Judith's signature. "Remove trees by any means necessary before inspection." As I stared at my phone in shock, a community alert popped up. "Emergency HOA meeting, 3 p.m. today. Attendance mandatory." I texted Margaret, "Are you coming back for the meeting?" She replied instantly, "Already here with the district attorney. Don't tell anyone. Bring your evidence." Could this meeting be the turning point in our battle? Or was it another trap set by Judith and Karen to finish me off completely? I walked into the packed community center, gripping my phone with the evidence. Every chair was filled. People stood against the walls, whispering about the solar panel damage and my burning trees. I noticed TV news vans outside. Someone had tipped them off. Harold Jenkins, the HOA lawyer, stood at the front, looking sweaty and nervous. Judith was nowhere to be seen, but Karen sat in the front row, wearing a smug smile. "Where's our president?" someone shouted. Harold cleared his throat. "Miss Palmer sends her regrets. She had an unexpected matter to attend to." "You mean the police showed up at her house?" yelled Mrs. Gonzalez from the back. The room erupted in shocked voices. Karen jumped up and grabbed the microphone. "Everyone calm down. As vice president, I'll run this meeting. First order of business, voting on fines for the island property's damaged trees and lightning sabotage." "Sabotage?" I stood up. "You think I controlled the lightning?" The room laughed nervously. Karen's face turned red. "I have something to share," I announced, walking to the front. Karen tried to block me, but Harold surprisingly stepped between us. "The chair recognizes the island resident," he said firmly. I connected my phone to the projector. The picture of Karen paying Derek appeared on the screen. This was taken yesterday morning before my trees were deliberately burned. I swiped to the next photo, Judith's signed order. Gasps filled the room. Karen lunged for my phone, but Harold grabbed her arm. "That's fake!" she screamed. The back door opened, and Margaret Thompson walked in with a stern-looking woman in a suit and 2 police officers. "District Attorney Rivera," the woman introduced herself. "We're investigating financial fraud and property destruction. Ms. Matthews, please remain seated." One officer stood beside Karen while the other guarded the door. The DA addressed the crowd. "We've uncovered disturbing evidence. The solar company that installed your panels is owned by Judith Palmer's brother-in-law. The HOA paid triple the market rate, with the difference split between several board members." A news reporter slipped in, camera rolling. Thomas Harrison jumped up. "But the solar project was for clean energy for our community." Margaret stepped forward. "Follow the money, Thomas. Your HOA fees increased 40% last year. Did you ever see the financial statements? They were never properly filed. The DA nodded. We've frozen the HOA accounts pending investigation. The maintenance fund is nearly empty. Harold looked pale. As legal counsel, I must advise that the HOA faces serious liability for the damaged trees and illegal burning. Karen suddenly bolted for the side door, but the officer caught her before she reached it. "Let go of me," she shrieked. "Do you know who my husband is?" "Yes, ma'am," the officer replied calmly. "He's already at the station answering questions about wire fraud." The room fell silent. Then Eleanor Wallace stood up, leaning on her cane. "I've lived here 30 years and never seen such shameful behavior. We need new leadership, honest leadership." She pointed at me. "Someone who fights for what's right, even when standing alone." Clapping started slowly, then grew louder. 3 months later, my island looked different. The remaining trees were growing fast, already tall enough to block where the solar panels had been. Those were gone now, properly recycled and reinstalled on the community center roof, where they actually made sense. I dug my hands into the rich soil, planting new seedlings where the burned trees had stood. A boat approached my dock, Thomas and Eleanor, bringing lunch. "The new garden looks wonderful," Eleanor called, waving. "Thanks to your special tree food," I replied, helping her from the boat. Thomas handed me a newspaper. "Thought you'd want to see this." The headline read, "HOA Fraud Case. Former Officials Sentenced." We sat on my porch, enjoying sandwiches and lemonade, looking out at the peaceful lake. No ugly panels, no angry neighbors, no threats, just nature and good company. "You know," Thomas said, "when I first complained about those panels, I never imagined where it would lead." Eleanor patted my hand. "Sometimes standing up for your land means standing up for everyone. One person can make a difference." I nodded, watching a family of ducks swim by my shore. The new HOA rules are framed in my office. All major decisions require 75% resident approval. Private property remains private, and all meetings must have refreshments. "Sometimes you need to grow an army of trees to protect your home," Thomas added with a laugh. "But in the end, it's the community you build that matters most. Justice, like those trees, just needed room to grow." Hope you enjoyed this story. If you'd like to hear more, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel. See you in the next one.